My story begins about 2,500 years ago with a man, a philosopher named Aristotle. You may have heard of him. Aristotle one day had a kind of bright idea. He he claimed, he asserted that knowledge, all human knowledge, all of it, could be classified, could be organized according to its substance, its quantity, its quality, its relation, its place, its time, position, state, action, and passion. You get the sense reading about Aristotle's theory that it was a weekend project. And you know what? We've all been there. We've all been there. We're working on some difficult project and we think, okay, I'm really stressed out and overwhelmed. Let me just take a weekend, get organized, quote unquote, get all my stuff together, and then I can start on Monday nice and clear-minded. Little did Aristotle know, first of all, there's no indication that he succeeded, that he actually succeeded in creating this kind of universal classification, this universal taxonomy for all knowledge. But little did Aristotle know he was kicking off a millennia-long quest by many, many thinkers and philosophers and writers and scientists to create a universal taxonomy. A taxonomy is simply it's a classification system for not just animals or plants or elements on the periodic table, but for all knowledge, for everything, basically. A couple thousand years later, there were definitely many people in between who tried, but a couple thousand years later, Francis Bacon, the scientist and philosopher, said, you know what, let me take a crack at this. He was probably also having a tough week and needed a nice little weekend project to get organized. And he said, you know, Aristotle was a smart guy, but it's too complicated. That's all too much to think about. Really, there's just three categories: memory, which is basically history; reason, which is philosophy; and imagination, which is the fine arts. Okay, a simpler system that he had. A few hundred years later, Ranganathan, who was a mathematician and the father of Indian library science, said, you know what, let me take another shot at this. We've tried many times before, but let me introduce these sort of more abstract categories that can be more universal, like personality, matter, energy, space, and time. Let's try to classify all human knowledge according to these 5 criteria. Okay, and he actually introduced a more sophisticated system called faceted classification that was designed to classify our more plentiful, complex modern knowledge. But none of them succeeded. No one was really able to pull off this feat to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Right? It was sort of a hopeless quest until Google came around in the early 2000s, the early 20th century, and made this their mission. If these words sound familiar, this was Google's original mission statement. This was the reason that Google came to be, was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And in one sense, Google succeeded finally, where so many others had failed. And they succeeded by taking a completely different approach than anyone had taken before. Instead of creating a fixed set of categories, a fixed hierarchy where all knowledge was organized into, and instead of using manual human effort, you know, legions of organizers or librarians or filers to individually, with human manual effort, decide where each and every piece of knowledge goes, they used a completely different approach. They used technology, graph databases, and crawlers and indexing and different kinds of technology that made it possible for computers, which work night and day and never sleep, to do that organizing for us and to do it in a way that's constantly evolving and changing. And most importantly, that can be searched with a single question or a single word and instantly find your answer. Okay. So in a sense, this little search box was the answer to a millennia's long quest, and it's really changed the world, hasn't it? Think about, so it's kind of already part of our day-to-day life, but think about how natural and easy it is for us to go to Google anytime we have a question, or even just want to find something or find, a resource. It's almost an unconscious habit. Google has especially changed the world of information, right? So much of what in the past would have been involved in, referencing and classifying and cross-referencing and then creating indices all manually is now just accomplished with this simple little page that is free. But, there's always a but. There is a realm of information that Google has not transformed, that search engines cannot even really touch. And that is the world of personal information. Okay, think about personal information. Information that is not necessarily authoritative, is not officially verified, is not even public, and yet it's still important to you. It's relevant, it's personally relevant to you and your life. Okay, think about how much of your day you spend interacting with personal information. At first glance, it might seem like that's a small niche, like, oh, I think Google pretty much takes care of everything. Maybe there's a few things here and there that a search engine can't find. But I want to suggest to you that actually this seemingly small category of personal information is actually vast. It's actually multifaceted and complex, and it's actually fundamental to living our lives. I'll give you 4 examples. So when I say personal information, I mean the simple little bits of documents and data that you use to run your life, your to-do list, right? Google can't really search your to-do list, can't really index that. Your calendar, your agenda, your contacts, your notes, all things that are extremely relevant to you personally, but that aren't really subject to search engine technology. Think about your personal memories, your photos. There we've made a little bit of progress. We have things like Google Photos and Apple Photos and Flickr, right? But still kind of manually intensive. Even more so with videos, and even more so with, think about all the messages you've exchanged, the emails, the stories, the experiences that are your personal history, your personal background that might not have any importance to anyone else in the world, but they do to you. Think about your personal perspective. Okay, not the content you consume, we can search that, but your interpretations of the content you consume, your opinions about the ideas you've read about, your theories, your beliefs, your hypotheses about how the world works or your organization works or how your health works or how relationships work. Okay, your takes, even if they're not fully vetted, fully proven, fully authoritative. And finally, your personal knowledge. We live in a knowledge-driven economy. We're in this knowledge era of human history, supposedly. What about your ideas, your insights, your expertise, your lessons, your tacit knowledge? It's kind of amazing. If I asked you, what do you know about X? And instead of X, insert whatever topic you have the most expertise about. Okay, at first you might think of what you have expertise about and think, yes, I am an expert in that. I do have that expertise. But can you tell me what it is? Can you name the top 10 most important insights from your field? Can you tell me what is your particular approach to your discipline or your area? Can you tell me the biggest lessons you learned from your successes or failures from your career so far? Most people I've found absolutely cannot. So we're left with this very weird situation where if I want to know about a topic, it's easier for me to search the entire internet, what everyone else thinks, experts, leaders, or even just random people spouting off whatever, it's easier for me to find out what they all know about some area of expertise than it is for me to find out what I myself know about my own area of expertise. Isn't that odd? Isn't that so strange? That personal knowledge seems to be sort of this final frontier of making knowledge universally useful and accessible. Over the past couple decades, since about the late 90s, a field has arisen, a new discipline has been created called personal knowledge management, or PKM, to resolve this lack, this shortfall. Okay. Started in libraries, actually at UCLA, here not far from where I am, and spread all around the world. There's now conferences and journals and academic studies and research and all sorts of things happening with personal knowledge management. My contribution, my part of this field is to popularize it. My mission is to make more people all over the world discover PKM, how it might help them, and how to actually put it into practice. PKM also has a historical legacy, and it's a historical legacy that is almost as old as our efforts to classify all knowledge. It's called commonplace books. The word commonplace comes from the ancient Greek, and it was during political assemblies or courts of law or other meetings. It was the record-keeping mechanism. It was a book or scroll or something where the records were kept. One common place where all decisions and records and ideas and actions were recorded. And the amazing thing about commonplace books is it keeps popping up in history again and again and again and again. Every time there's a period of change or uncertainty, every time there's an epoch where people need to just make sense of what is happening to them, there seems to be this practice of keeping a private book or notebook or journal, such as the one you see here, where it's not about necessarily what is factual. Of course, you can write facts in there, but it's also your opinions, your ideas, your theories, your pictures that inspire you, stories that move you, memories you want to revisit. It's really like an extension of your mind to more accurately reflect the information. Really, it comes down to information, to content that you find valuable enough to keep and to revisit over time. Okay, so commonplace books have arisen in Japan and China during periods of intense change and uncertainty, in Eastern Europe, during periods of uncertainty, most famously in Europe, especially Northern Europe and Western Europe. This practice really profoundly shaped so much of the way people thought during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And I think for that very same reason, it's being reinvented again today. We again live in a period of intense change and uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. All of our grand narratives about history, about nation states, about the future and the past are all breaking down. And in a way, we're having to individually, on a person-by-person level, at a person-by-person level, make sense of what is happening to us and around us. So in a funny way, we're back to that original classic quest, but with a little twist, okay? In one sense, it's easier. Our quest, our mission has become a lot easier. Instead of trying to organize the world's information, especially at the rate at which the world is producing it, we're just trying to organize an individual's, just our own information. And instead of trying to make it universally accessible and useful to all people in so many different situations and backgrounds, we're just trying to make it personally accessible and useful, just for us, just for ourselves. So in a way, this is a much smaller, easier scope, right? It's much smaller in scope. But in another way, and this is what I've discovered, is it's way harder. In a very strange way, paradoxically, it's harder. Because when you deal with an individual, you absolutely have to go into that person's psychology. You have to think about and address their fears, their hopes, their hangups, their idiosyncrasies, their baggage, their temperament, their preferred thinking style, the way that their individual mind works. And in a funny way, it's actually harder to do all that for yourself because you're sort of immersed in it. You can't see the forest for the trees. Another reason that it is in a way harder to make information individually and personally useful and accessible. So I wrote a book, spent many years teaching, speaking, coaching, a ton of personal experimentation to write this book right here, which I'm holding in my hand and which you can see on the screen. It's called The Para Method. It's a small book. It's about a third the size of a typical hardcover nonfiction book. And that's because it's incredibly distilled. It's really just 100 pages or so, summarizing and distilling more than a decade of my experience teaching people to make their own digital commonplace book. I'm going to introduce you to it briefly and then say a little bit about kind of how it works and why it works. So let me just take a drink of coffee. So PARA is an acronym. It is 4 letters, each of which stands for an essential category of information in your life and work. And I assert, I propose that these 4 categories, everyone has them, every single person in the world has them, and all of the information, all of it, in any format, coming in any medium, through any channel or platform, in any format, for whatever purpose, can be saved in one of these 4 categories. The first is project, the first and most important. These are pretty much the conventional definition of projects, short-term efforts in your work or life that you're working on now. There's areas of responsibility, which are long-term responsibilities you want to manage over time, don't necessarily have an end point, an end date, but something you want to keep track of kind of over the long term. There are resources, basically everything else, topics or interests that may be useful in the future, anything you're passionate about, interested in, curious about, any assets or templates or reusable pieces of information that you might want to reference again and again. And finally, there's the archive, which is inactive items, anything that is inactive or finished or no longer relevant from the previous 3 categories. So projects that have been finished or put on hold, areas of responsibility that are no longer active, but that you want to keep reference information about, resources that you're no longer interested in, but that you want to keep around, all go into the archive. Within each of these top level categories, these kind of big buckets, there is one more layer. There is one more set of folders or tags or links or whatever is the organizing mechanism that you use, which is one specific folder or tag or link or whatever it is dedicated to each of the individual projects that are currently active right now. A folder dedicated to each of the areas that are active in your life right now. A folder for each of the resources that you're keeping information about. And as you work with those 3 categories and you finish things and things go out of date, you'll put them in the archives. Okay, so 2 levels, 4 top level categories, and then a larger number of subcategories, each one of them related to not just an abstract kind of like an abstract category, like the ones we saw at the beginning of my talk, you know, space and time and personality and all these things, but actual things happening in your life right now, real things that you actually have to move forward and keep track of. When it comes to personal information, the biggest constraint, the biggest bottleneck is your time and energy. Okay, when you're dealing with, say, a library or a database, you might have full-time technicians, full-time IT people, librarians, specialists who can dedicate hours and hours per day. That's their job, to keep it all organized. When it comes to your personal information, you don't. You don't, right? Energy and time, bandwidth, basically, is the overwhelming constraint when it comes to personal information and knowledge. So in my work teaching and coaching people, what I found is that for each piece of information, you really only have time and energy to ask one question. One question at most. Even that, there's times where that will be difficult and you'll have to kind of, put things on hold for a while. But one question is where we max out. That's the most we can afford to spend thinking about each piece of knowledge that comes across our mind. I've tried many questions. Some of the questions that you saw from Aristotle and Francis Bacon and Ranganathan and others, many other questions have been proposed. But I think when it comes to the level of the individual, that this is the best one. This is the single question you can ask that yields the biggest results, which is how and when will I use this next? And I know that's kind of cheating because it's sort of two questions. But the reason it works is that really there's only 4 answers. To make answering this question even easier, I'll make a multiple choice for you. There's not an infinite number of choices. There's just 4. Either it's a piece of information that is relevant to one of your current projects, and I put those kind of at the top of the pyramid because that's the most important. Those are things that are short-term, they're active, they're alive right now. There might be actions you need to take today or in the next hour or tomorrow or this week related to your projects. They should come first. Second, a piece of information could be relevant to one of your areas. If not, it could be relevant to your resources. And if not, it can go in the archives or simply be deleted. What you're looking at on the screen is called an information hierarchy. It's one of the oldest and most persistent patterns in really all of information. And what it tells us is that there is a little bit of information that is most important, which is the top of the pyramid, which you see as projects. Then there's a little more information that is less important, but still important, which is areas. Then there's the rest of everything else, the mass of other stuff that may be worth keeping, but is really much less important, and that's the bottom half of the pyramid. There's a few reasons that I think this works so well. And there are reasons that this approach, this method is so simple that it can be used from 3rd grade classrooms. I know of at least one 3rd grade classroom that's using it to, organize their class supplies and their arts and crafts, all the way to executives at major companies, whole entire teams and departments at Fortune 500 companies, governmental agencies, leaders. It's really a methodology that applies to an extremely broad range of people. The first reason is that it's just so simple with the intention of minimizing your cognitive load. This is really the most important point. You do not have extra cognitive load, or in other words, decision-making capacity, or in other words, bandwidth to spare, do you? Pretty much, I don't know about you, but feel like just managing my work and then my life and my household and my family, just basically adulting, takes pretty much 100% of my bandwidth pretty much every single day. So the simplicity is not for its own sake. It's not just an aesthetic thing to look cool. It's about minimizing the amount of decisions you have to make. Second, it's actionable. Okay, we are not full-time knowledge classifiers. We are not trying to build a library of Alexandria. We are trying to move forward tangible projects and reach specific goals, both across our working career and our personal lives. The information that we organize should be structured accordingly to support those projects and goals. And third, it's universal. Going back to that original quest that Aristotle kicked off. Okay, it's universal, but not quite in the sense that he thought. It's not universal in the sense that it works for, all of humanity, but it is universal across an individual's systems. Okay, every device you probably use many devices. Every platform you use, I find most modern knowledge workers use a dozen or so different platforms if you really include them all. Not to mention the people you work with. Think about all the places where you organize and share knowledge that multiple people have to access: a shared Google Drive, a shared Notion doc, a shared ClickUp space. Okay, these four categories are so easy to understand, and really they use terminology and concepts that everyone knows. Everyone knows what a project is. Everyone knows what a responsibility is, a resource, and an archive. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to create a common set of terms that you always understand across the various domains of your life, and so do others. To finish off here, I want to take a sharp turn. This talk so far has been pretty conceptual. I've tried to keep it pretty simple, but I know organizing stuff can always be a little abstract. So I want to finish by telling you where this all came from. This is something I don't think I've really talked about before. And it explains why para is the way it is, and specifically why I am such a huge believer in projects, why projects are this overriding priority in our information, but also in our lives. Okay, why I think projects are so important and why I think you should consider them to be so important. These photos are from my service in the Peace Corps. From about 2009 to 2011, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer. The Peace Corps, if anyone doesn't know, is a U.S. government organization that was founded in the 1960s. And it basically, since then, has sent Americans of all ages abroad to developing countries to serve in various capacities: democracy building, health, education. My role specifically was in education. I was assigned, you don't get to choose where you go, you are simply assigned. I was assigned to a small town called Kupiansk in eastern Ukraine, far northeastern Ukraine. My day job was to be a teacher. So every day I would pack up my stuff, put on my very, very warm clothing, especially in the winter, and head over to school, where I would teach grades 3rd through 10, 3rd grade through 10th grade, English. Teach them what I knew on these ancient chalkboards like the one you see on the left, how to improve their English skills, which was really a gateway for them to better jobs, better futures, better living standards, to working in Europe or in other countries, and to being successful and accessing the internet. So my day job was teaching English, but my real passion was a program that I started called PBC, which stands for Projects Bring Change. Probably no surprise. And what I would do is go to summer camps. Summer camps are a big tradition in Ukraine. Everyone during the summer, all the young people go into the countryside, to the rivers, to lakes, to the seaside, and they have these summer camps. Some of them would be English summer camps. And what I would do is recruit small groups of especially promising teenagers, students. They were in high school, such as the ones you see in the photo on the bottom there. And what I would do is teach them what we would call basic life skills, or project management or productivity skills, really basic stuff. Things that we probably learned just as part of our normal schooling. Things like how to make a goal, how to organize some materials, how to make a budget, how to make a timeline, how to call someone and ask for a donation. These kind of basic organizing, both in the sense of organizing information and organizing a community, or organizing an effort or a project. And we would then use those skills over the course of a few days to plan and execute a community service project. Instead of keeping it abstract, we would immediately put it into action, doing a trash cleanup, or painting a mural, or fixing a playground or raising money for an important cause, something that contributed to their local community. This was kind of a new concept for many of them because in post-Soviet countries, so often the case is that the state is supposed to do all those things. The old centralized Soviet state was responsible for picking up trash and for maintaining buildings and for keeping parks and all these things. In the years since the fall of the Soviet Union, that is no longer the case. And what we were really doing is exploring what it meant to just step up and contribute to your own community using whatever knowledge and skills and resources you had at your disposal. And, you know, these little projects were trivial. Okay, they didn't exactly change Ukrainian society, doing a trash pickup or painting a mural on the side of a building or whatever it was. Those things are trivial. But what wasn't trivial, what was actually incredibly profound to me, was seeing the change that even such a small project could have in these kids. Remember, this was just a few days. It all had to happen during at most, week-long summer camp. But executing these small community service projects, I began to see these kids completely change how they saw themselves. I began to see, sometimes in real time, almost the look in their eyes as they realized that this light came on, this awareness that they were leaders, that they had everything that they needed to make a difference. They didn't have to wait. They didn't need permission. They didn't need some authority to ask them to do it or to choose them. I'll never forget this brainstorm that we made. One of my groups was telling me, "Oh, there's nothing we can do. You know, we don't have any money, and you know, it's just too hard. And oh, that you know problem, that part of town has been a mess just since we can remember. That nothing was possible." And we just did a simple brainstorm on the chalkboard using Post-its. On one side of the chalkboard, we did a brainstorm of the projects that we could do, basically the needs that the community service had. What were the needs? What were the projects that we could execute if we could do anything? On the other side of the chalkboard, we did a brainstorm of resources. Every kind of resource they had access to, any tools, any supplies, any donations, any money, even if it was just a little bit. Also resources like knowledge. What did they know? What did they know how to do? What was their knowledge of their community? Even relationships. Who did they know in their community who might be able to help, who had a special skill, a special tool, had a pickup truck, had a wheelbarrow even. And then the magical moment was when we looked at these two brainstorm clouds and we just began to match them. We began to match every need with a resource. By the time we were done, almost every need that we could think of had some kind of resource already existing in the community that they had access to that could either solve it or at least make a big difference. Stop sharing that. After a couple years in the Peace Corps, I came back to San Francisco to start my kind of professional career. And not long after I arrived, I started doing the coaching and the teaching, and sometimes for free, sometimes with friends, sometimes running workshops in the co-working space for my fellow coworkers on what I was learning about productivity, about personal effectiveness, about how to organize knowledge. And to my surprise, I saw the exact same phenomenon at work in the lives of these high-powered, in many cases, elite professionals, as I saw in my Ukrainian students. Some self-doubt, some uncertainty, some questions about whether they were really capable, whether they were really able to make the change, often in their own careers or on their team or with their customers, that they wanted to make. And so I took the very same approach. What is a project? How could you, in a matter of days or weeks at most, create a plan, create a goal, assemble some resources, take some actions? And what I kept finding again and again, and still find to this day, I don't know of a better mechanism or a faster mechanism to change your identity to completely transform how you see yourself when you look in the mirror, to really radically elevate what you believe you're capable of doing than a simple project. That observation, that fact is so important. It's so powerful that what I recommend, if you take away one thing from what I've said today, is that you organize your entire digital life, all the resources and knowledge you have access to, around the completion of those projects and goals. That is the heart and the essence of Para. And that's it. Thank you.
Amazing. Give it up for Tiago, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, fantastic. I think hearing about that last part too really brought home the origins for us as well. That was I know that resonated a lot with folks. I think we have time for questions, and I'm sure there's a bunch. So if you could raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand feature, and we'll get some questions for Tiago around the Peace Corps, around Para, and everything in between. Yeah, Amy, nice to see you.
Did you keep in touch with your students? I'm sure a lot of you're thinking about them a lot right now.
I am. Yes. Yeah. It's been obviously such an understatement, but a really hard, not just past few years, but if you go back to 2014, 2015, it's sort of the initial stages of the war we're seeing today. It's been an incredibly difficult decade. Most of my students have left. Thankfully, actually, they've left either Eastern Ukraine and gone to Western Ukraine, or left the country altogether. In many cases, their English skills and their digital and sort of professional skills have enabled them to go further and to find better situations in other countries than they would otherwise. So thankfully, most of them are safe. They've had to leave the country, but it's been just an absolute tragedy. And yes, I have kept in touch with I'd say a few of them.
Yeah, so I was just curious. May have already covered it and apologize. I showed up late, but I've fully adapted the second brain for my personal life. Now I do run an agency, and we have different client projects, of course, and I tried to duplicate the same methodology for the business, but it can sometimes get kind of scattered, and there's some gray areas, obviously, with me running both of them. Do you suggest having one second brain for personal and business, or do you suggest your personal and then you can build a similar framework? Just because when I'm brainstorming, whatever, if I'm on the treadmill or something brainstorming, I add resources. I'm like, okay, well, this is an idea, not yet going to bring it to fruition. And while it's kind of cooking in the framework, I want to wait until I bring it into the business side. Does that make sense? Because I have two different workspaces in Notion, and just try to see if you recommend keeping them that separate or how to blend it safely.
Yeah, good question. So what I would recommend is you can and probably should have both. But what's so important is that you have either part of your second brain or, one of your second brains that is totally private and personal. I sometimes see people think, well, the ultimate purpose of all this information is to share and to, share and collaborate with others. So let me just, use my company wiki or my team's Notion workspace or our shared Google Drive to just store everything. And that really doesn't work because, excuse me, I think this is why. When information ideas first arise, they're often really random, they're messy, they're not polished. Sometimes they don't make sense. Sometimes they're kind of dumb. Like you sometimes need to develop them and kind of think them through and really bring them to a certain level of polish, a certain level of kind of respectability before you share them with other people. You don't want to be the guy on your team that is always just like, oh, look at this, look at that. And people are just like, what even is this? This makes no sense to me. Like, you don't want to be that person. Okay. You do want it to reach a certain level of polish before it gets shared. But you don't want that certain level of polish to be a barrier to you capturing ideas in the first place, right? So you need a private, let's say, second brain, and that might be an app on your phone, which is like the most close to the vest, private, personal place. No one else is going to look there pretty much to save ideas in the first place. And then later, when it's time to share and collaborate, it goes to something more public and shareable. Now, where that dividing line is up to you, and you have a few different options. Sometimes they're completely separate apps. Like for me, I have Evernote for my personal stuff and Notion and ClickUp for anything that's for the company. Or it could be within one application itself. Like maybe you just have some projects that are work and right next to them, other projects that are personal, and then some areas that are work and some that are personal. Right? So they don't necessarily have to be completely separate software programs, but there needs to be some kind of dividing line so you know that stuff is public, this stuff is private.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate that.
Sure. I also have a chapter in my book which is all about using Para for teams, which anyone interested in that topic can check out.
So I'm curious about a couple of things. One, when it comes to visibility of folders within the Para method, you mentioned going only 2 levels deep. But for me, that has not been the case, and I'm not able to, or I'm curious to know how you approach it, because the way I do it is I change the names of the files, or I add like an underscore or a symbol to increase the visibility of things that might be like that go too deep into the Para folders. So I'm curious to know, how are you able to manage everything with only 2 levels? And then I'm also curious about maintaining Para across multiple platforms. So if you're using a Todoist or email, things like that, how do you ensure that you're aware of everything that exists for a project across all tools that you use?
Yeah, okay. So for the first one, the 2 levels is really think of it like a helpful constraint. Okay, you can do more, no one will stop you, no alarms, sirens will go off. But think about what you're starting to do when you have 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of subfolders upon subfolders and subfolders. Yeah, I think there's a few things that are happening. First of all, you're hiding things, right? Things that are buried. The deeper they're getting buried in that hierarchy, the less, as you also mentioned, the less the chances that you're gonna, come across it. You're also creating more work for yourself when you go to replicate that structure across platforms, right? If you have, let's say, 3 levels to your folder structure, and you're using, typical person uses 3, 4, 5, 6 different platforms, you're now having to replicate, 3 levels across all those. It's kind of a lot of work, right? So the answer is kind of the answer to your second question, which is so much of that problem, the pitfalls involved in kind of like too many layers, too much complexity, is solved by keeping projects small. Keeping projects small, think about it. Like as soon as a project gets big, there starts to be problems that you can't really avoid. You just have more stuff to manage. You have more layers of the hierarchy. You have more kinds of data. Now you have to start introducing, more sophisticated ways of organizing that inevitably take more time, take more effort, and have to be maintained far into the future. But if you keep a project small, like my typical project takes place in about 2 weeks. For a 2-week project, I'll accumulate maybe 5 to 10 items, for the average project, 5 to 10 PDFs, text documents, photos, diagrams, reports. With 5 to 10 items, you don't have to organize them at all. There's nothing to organize. You just put them in a single list. You just have them. You can look at all of them in one glance, see what they are, what they're called, find exactly what you need. And so this idea of micro projects, making your projects very small and quickly completed, even if the ultimate project is huge, right? Like, so my example I always use is writing a book. Probably the biggest project I've ever undertaken took me 3.5, 4 years. But the way that I conceived of it in my mind and in my second mind was just as a long series of micro projects, right? Like the first project was just to find an agent. And for that was actually like a month or two long project. All I did was try to find my agent. Didn't even worry about anything else. Then that was finished. Spent another month or two finding an editor. That was the only project that I focused on related to my book, right? I think so often there's a big temptation to start this mega project because you're excited, right? You're like, let me just start 15 different work streams all at the same time. And then I'm gonna make progress along all these fronts 24/7 all at once, which works for about 3 or 4 days. And then the weekend hits and then you just collapse. And then you come back on Monday and you're like, what was I thinking? Oh my gosh, I don't have the energy for this. This is way too much stuff. So what I instead advocate is for people to just keep that frontier very small, just work on the next step, which is usually a project within itself. And that way you almost don't have to worry about how to organize your support material because there's just so little of it. And then you finish that project, archive it away, and start over fresh. Every 2 or 3 weeks, you're starting over in a sense, rather than trying to organize all the information in one giant hierarchy.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Thank you. Yep. Thank you.
My question is about the management of information across physical media. So, for example, if you want to organize your systems, I think you are more of a proponent of the online version, but there's also the whole offline method, the old school Zettelkasten and all that. We don't have to go into that. My main question is, for me, my problem would be reading a book and wanting to write notes, and then either if it's a PDF or a physical book, most importantly, having to sort of manage the notes and the file itself. In this case, if I use like on a more academic level, if you use like a reference management system, you may have the PDF linked with the reference in the system there, or you have the file in a folder, and then you have the ability to annotate inside that sort of software, but also you may have your own note-taking system. So for that sort of application, you also have, of course, physical books, and you want to put all that together. And I've had really a hard time combining. Maybe the note-taking part is probably the easiest, but the connection between a physical media and the note, like when I find the note, I have to make all these adjustments about where did I find this. I guess it occurs also with if it's a website, old website, something like that. What sort of practical ways of solving this have you found? Because I've found that it's a real bottleneck for me to consume content, keep those concise ideas, and then link them together later, and then go back. And this loop, it's really not working for me right now. Thank you so much.
I mean, what you're describing is the whole issue. That's the whole question that we're trying to solve here. There's not one app that you will download that will solve that will resolve the problem you just described. We're all struggling with it. I struggle with it often. We're trying to create something that is almost a paradox, a system that is totally comprehensive and yet also totally easy to use and fluid and flexible. A system that is personalized and so customized to us, but we also don't want to do much work. We want to just download something off the shelf that works from day one. We want something that is, it's like all these paradoxes that I almost think transcend, personal knowledge management. That's kind of what it means to be human. Think about the paradoxes of being human. We want all the knowledge, but we also just want to be left in peace and not have to think about everything. We want change and progress, but we also just want to be comfy and, and comfortable in our nice little home. It's like, yeah, a second brain is almost just, it's not going to solve all those questions for you. But I think there is a certain corner. There's a certain like small subset of those issues that it can solve. The one that comes to mind, because you mentioned this one, is reading books. When I look at a solution like Readwise, I don't know if you're all familiar with Readwise. They're a company that makes an app called Reader. So if you search, I know it's kind of redundant, but Readwise Reader, and someone I'm sure can drop a link in the chat who's familiar with it. This is practically a perfect solution to reading at least ebooks, which is you read a Kindle ebook on a Kindle device, or it could be the Kindle app on a smartphone or an iPad or even your computer. You make a highlight by just putting your finger down and making a highlight. Could not be easier. You can even add a note, like some of your own comments if you want. Within a few minutes, with no further action on your part, you don't have to sync or export or anything. Just that highlight that you chose will just appear almost magically in your note-taking app. And you can use any one of a dozen different note-taking apps that they support. Like, to me, like, what else could you want? You know, you just did the most minimal amount of effort and it appeared in a personal, private, secure place that only you have access to, which you can then annotate and you can underline and you can even edit and change and do anything you want to. That is almost like the 80-20 of having a second brain, is to just do that, what I just described, with your reading. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think it's probably one of the most mature, well-developed, you know, kind of second brain solutions. Are you familiar with that, João? Is that something that you could try as an experiment?
Yeah, I actually tried it, and for some reason it started feeling like I was already doing this. I was already reading the thing. So, and really the transfer seemed like the easy part. The thing that I wanted was to connect them seamlessly. And also you're talking about ebooks, which really applies to this. And then the problem for me was more about where to put the physical file and the physicality of it, because then if you think about downloading a file multiple times, something gets released in a later edition, and now you have two, and now you're not sure which one you use. You know, those kinds of things. I've tried Readwise, and it wasn't fixing those specific problems. Yeah.
When you say physical file, do you mean a physical printed book, or do you mean like the database file?
You're more like the database. The database is more massive for me because if I have a book on a bookshelf, I could always, you know, it's more limited data in that sense. It's more like localized. It's, you know, actually occupies physical space. But the digital mass of um, downloading and just where to put this file, right, immediately, and then the article has different topics that it discusses. I can't just say this is part of a single project. It's probably part of multiple projects,
I
and
know.
then
I don't have I don't
yeah.
have a great answer for you. There's no perfect solution. It's just trade-offs. It's just what is more important, what is less important, which downfalls and pitfalls are you most willing to put up with? I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, João. And I guess you can take comfort in just knowing, I mean, I pretty much think about and study this 24/7. It's just all trade-offs, you know? I'll kind of finish saying one thing. You know, this thing that we're doing, extracting information from multiple sources, compiling it into our own centralized resource to use for our own purposes, it's kind of a revolutionary act. You know, no one wants you to do this. Definitely the tech companies. There's a reason that this is a little bit difficult. You know, Amazon doesn't want you doing this, extracting, you know, the text from its ebooks. Apple, you know, there's no way to sync content with Apple Notes, for example. No tech company, probably the government, the authorities don't want you to do it either. Even at work, some people might be suspicious. Like, why are you compiling all this data? Like, is that proprietary? You know, is that the company's data? A lot of people will be suspicious of you. They'll question you. There's something very kind of radical and insurrectionary about just taking control of your own data, even if it's just like passages and excerpts from books that you yourself bought. It's kind of wild. What I would say, though, is that it's worth it. That the other side of that revolutionary act is an incredible amount of freedom and independence and autonomy that you can then use however you want. We're really trying to break free our digital chains, you know, from the digital servitude that is so often the case online. That's what we're doing with creating a second brain and doing something as mundane as organizing our files and notes.
I feel like your community can stay for another 2 hours because the questions are there, and the presentation's fascinating. I think it's just a testament to how many lives this work has touched and how important it is. And I think folks especially resonated with some of the stories to show also the humanity behind the projects and behind the methodology itself. So I just want to say thank you for sharing this with our community and with yours, and yeah, really for putting this on. Yeah, thanks, Tiago.
Thank you so much, Michael, and Jenny, and everyone on the Ultraspeaking team. It's been a pleasure working with you. I learned so much. Really shaped how I prepare my talks, how I plan them, and how I deliver them. And as a result, I'm doing a lot more public speaking. So thank you for the work that you do. I've been a huge beneficiary.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, thanks so much. Folks that I haven't met face to face, thanks for joining. This is part of the Ultraspeaking community. If you haven't heard of us, come check us out. We're ultraspeaking.com. We'll check if we can share this recording with all of you, because I know a lot of you are after it. And if you have questions, I'm sure you can reach out to Tiago's team as well. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.